Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mansueto Colloquium. Glad to see so many of you here. It's a great pleasure to have one of Mansueto's friends, Chris Skrable, here to speak to us. Chris, for those of you who don't know him, is the inaugural executive director of the Chicago Studies Program and Experiential Learning. He's also an assistant dean of the undergraduate college here at UChicago. This meeting is being recorded. He works to create respectful academic projects and partnerships that help the college learn from and with the communities of the city in which it makes its home. So really important role that he plays here. He's originally from Virginia. He's got his academic background, I did not know this, in educational psychology, continental philosophy, and the social scientific study of religion and the religious experience. He's a lifelong educator, and he presents and consults nationally on community-engaged teaching and research. So, Chris, we're pleased to have you here today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much, not only for the introduction, Chris, but also for the invitation to do this. I feel like sometimes at the university, we sort of divide the world quite cleanly into people who think about things and people who do things. And normally I am in the latter category. And so it's exciting to be invited to think about things with people and to think about the things that we do a little bit. That said, I'm a little concerned that as between the introduction and some of what I'm going to present today, I'm probably going to kind of come out as a not so deeply closeted humanist in the course of all of this. And I know this is a very social scientific crowd, so I apologize in advance if I offend. Today, what I'd like to do is kind of performatively think with you about Chicago Studies, which is a program that I not only run, but that have also shaped over the past dozen years here at the university. There is definitely a we to Chicago Studies. We are a proud staff of 2 or 4, depending on how you count. We have a hire in process. We work with a group of 90 to 100 instructors who teach over 100 Chicago-focused classes each year. We have about another 25 who dip their toe into the Chicago waters through experiential learning, through microgrants that we run, which I'll talk about later. About 1,500 students pass through those classes most years. And of course, we have a network of both internal and external collaborators, which includes the Mansueto Institute and our other fellow offices from the Office of Research and Teaching Initiatives. Thank you, CCTL repping here today. Likewise, our friends in CIGU, with whom we share office space in this building. Thank you also for being here. Still, the responsibility for Chicago Studies really does fall quite uniquely on me. So a disclaimer, the ideas and positions and attitudes that are about to be represented are entirely mine. They do not reflect the opinions of the dean's office or anybody else at our proud institution. I'd like to begin, if I may, with an image, the same image that I used for my tiny slide. You probably did not look at it because you have seen it so often. It is the way that our university usually looks at our city. And these images tend to follow a fairly regular pattern. In the foreground, we see a building, usually in university Gothic, and if it's not the foreground, it's certainly plenty of examples of it right around. On the horizon, we see the skyline of the city, and peripherally, if we see it at all, and in some images we don't, peripherally we see other glimpses of the non-downtown portions of the city of Chicago. Sometimes we change the direction of this view. For example, this image where we're looking westward down the Midway, but the basic perspective, neo-Gothic in the front, lots of university, sort of a vague impression of something around us, that remains the same. If you go to UChicago Creative's website and search for, quote, aerial view of campus looking towards the city skyline, you will find 4,329 of these images. Most of these have been created by or commissioned by us because they reflect the way that we look at the world. For example, President Alivisatos' most recent email to the university community. Let me borrow one sentence. Quote, "Our institution arises from a compact of partnerships among students, families, alumni, and faculty with private individual supporters, foundations, corporations, and other institutions of civic society. And of course, with our largest single sponsor, the federal government." Absent from that long list is a mention of the communities or even the government of our city. But then you might object, isn't it there, in the background? The college's new international marketing campaign does a little bit better, maybe because it literally quotes me. Even then, the structure remains. It is fundamentally expressive of the mercantile capitalistic and later neoliberal constructs in which our institution was established and in which we have grown. It envisions the university as a privileged and protected space within which we can center ourselves on the production of intellectual capital, which we agree to orient towards the priorities of other centers of power, other kinds of production. Between those centers of power, there exists a frontier, both intellectual and literal, which is there for us to explore, to conquer, and even to dominate for our own ends, but which is otherwise accidental to our global purposes. And we have indeed dominated it. In our first half century, we invented entire fields of study by observing and theorizing about the city around us, exerting a profound technocratic power that reshaped how our city saw and divides itself, and then interpreted its own patterns of growth and change. In the 1950s, faced with significant racial change in the areas around our campus, we leveraged some of those same theoretical frameworks with procedural and policy and public relations acumen to devise remedies that reshaped our surrounding neighborhoods to better align with our ends, to create, quote, "a more compatible community," to pull a sentence from something in our archives. Along the way, we expanded our footprint to the north, to the west, to the south. When those holdings felt threatened by a perceived rise in street crime and a corresponding rise in the national temperature about public safety, a few decades later, we professionalized and expanded our security office, again, writing laws that lent powers of the state to our institution so we could better protect the area we planned and come to regard as our own, from 37th to 64th Streets, Cottage to Lakeshore Drive. When calls for civic responsibility on the part of higher education institutions, a movement that had its roots in the late 80s, finally reached UChicago with President Zimmer in 2007, we combined our offices of community relations and commercial real estate operations, along with a couple of legacy shops promoting student volunteerism, to form, quote, the Office of Civic Engagement, which designated a still larger area of focus, now from, I think it's 26th, all the way down to 79th Street. Using, I will note, the very structures that we ourselves had mapped out, the community areas, to define the spaces that we were claiming. Over these, we exercise a paternalistic power, a sense of helping to uplift, soft power, it used to be called when it was in fashion, and we continue to claim it as our area of focus. It's from this last period that Chicago Studies was born, leveraging seed money from the University of Chicago Women's Board in 2007 to create an occasional lecture series in which faculty could share their thoughts about the city, and an undergraduate journal, ditto, but with students. Candidly, and saying nothing about other initiatives from this same period, this was not a meaningful gesture, but it contained in itself the seeds of a more authentic turn towards the city. It's that turn and its implications that I'd really like to discuss with you. If we're being honest, the thing that redeemed Chicago Studies was and remains the bike tours, at least in spirit. Longtime college dean John Boyer's annual Southside History bike tours, which preceded our establishment by a decade or so, but had gotten so popular by 2007 that they really needed a home and a staff. The bike tours for John were a revival of something he deeply admired in the early university. That impulse to go out and see for ourselves, and then to talk about what was seen. There's a way in which this too is acquisitive, but it's also potentially wild and uncontrolled. It opens learning to the possibility of surprise, of disruption, of decentering of authority. You never know when the drawbridge is going to go up and interrupt your plans and set you on a different course to have a different experience, a new conversation, a new sensation that you didn't expect. The first time the drawbridge went up, by the way, on the 95th Street Bridge, I think it was our second year of doing this particular tour, we found ourselves on the west side of the bridge. And if you know the 95th Street Bridge, just west there stands a little shack that has a distinctive aroma to it, that is Calumet Fisheries. We were stranded outside Calumet Fisheries for 20 minutes, and nearly every student who had cash decided to go in and buy smoked fish for themselves. We then continued biking for another 3 hours and returned home to campus, providing the entire University of Chicago with a sensation that it had not had in quite a while. These kinds of experiences are also open to learning from and with new kinds of conversation partners, like this eclectic gang from the South Shore Bicycle Collaborative, who marshal the ride and along the way strike up conversations with students and faculty and me about their cycling activism, but also about the kinds of things they do when they're not riding their bikes, like, I don't know, teaching high school or teaching middle school or doing social work. You never know what's going to strike a chord with a student. And I've repeatedly facilitated the exchange of numbers so that conversations begun on the ride can continue, only to see them flower into volunteer commitments, internships, even thesis projects. This is the logic behind Chicago Studies' longest running and most significant set of investments, which offer microgrants to instructors and hire community members to offer classes about the city as term lecturers. We're facilitating and inviting disruptions to the classroom, both in where we teach and in whom we construe as a teacher. You never know what a guest is going to say, nor what will happen on your way to or from the place you're visiting, especially if you end up taking transit, which is what we strongly encourage. But the deeper effect of this part of our work is to decenter the university's more typical constructs of expertise and to validate a set of knowledges that don't always get considered in these hallowed halls. Parenthetically, that includes paying for those knowledges. And one of our longest running Chicago Studies rules is that no one should teach you Chicago students for free. In this year alone, we've paid over 100 guests to speak in 80 different classes and created courses around 3 different Chicagoans that students otherwise never would have heard about or from. The real goal is to shift our perspective on where knowledge resides and where it is that it may come from. Which brings me back to this image. What if, instead of starting here, we shift our focus, we change our perspective even slightly? This is nearly the same image. It's oriented exactly the same way, but it's taken from 5 blocks, exactly 5 blocks to the southwest of us. UChicago is still visible here, but now we're off center. We're at the upper right of the image, silhouetted against the lake. What do you notice in this slightly different perspective? What gets foregrounded for you? Not a rhetorical question. Paula.
The lack of green space.
Okay.
High rises,
Sorry.
high rise building.
Yes.
Rail yards.
Rail yards. What questions, if any, does it stir for you?
What is the housing density in that area?
What, if anything, does this tell us about UChicago that we perhaps didn't see in the previous views?
It's a tiny part of the city.
The wall kingdom.
How does it affect your feelings or thoughts about the various UChicago-centered narratives from the 30s, the 50s, the 80s, the 2010s that I brought up earlier?
We wonder what was happening 5 blocks south or north outside.
What does it mean to see our institution surrounded by a world that looks so incredibly different from it? I'll have to say, when I look at this, what I actually notice more than anything are the absences. This is a contemporary portrait, and missing from, for example, this rail yard is the rail line of the Chicago North Shore Railroad, which used to have a depot here. The North Shore was the electric equivalent to the South Shore line that runs all the way down through the Calumet. This one used to run north from the south side of Chicago all the way up through the North Shore. That line no longer exists. Also missing, although Parkway Gardens, the fairly infamous housing project of the Chicago Housing Authority, is sitting on the footprint, missing from here is what was called the White City. Not the fairgrounds of 1893, which was in Jackson Park, but rather an amusement park that was built to ape the grandeur of the White City in Jackson Park, and that constituted kind of an anchor institution for the 63rd Street Entertainment and Hotels corridor, which is also not especially evident from this contemporary photo. The White City, I might add, was a highly ambiguous location. It was a segregated institution. It was a white city in more ways than one. And as the neighborhood began to change racially, the White City was not able to keep up. They were unwilling to compromise on their principles, and as a result, they closed. I think their last ride was torn down in the 1930s. Of course, the White City evokes other memories of grandeur, including the grandeur that used to exist in Jackson Park, just to the east of this image, the grandeur that was accessed through a line of the Chicago Transit Authority Green Line, which used to go all the way to Jackson Park with stops at Dorchester and at University, as well as a stop at Stony Island that was one of the most important transit hubs in the entire city of Chicago, with streetcar lines and lines of the elevated train intersecting there with a very important Illinois Central stop, today a flag stop, but in the day, one of the gateways of the Great Migration to the city of Chicago, especially after the 1930s and the 1940s. Also missing from this image is the grandeur of what used to be called South Parkway, now MLK, which at the time was the location, the home of Chicago's Black upper class. It was the southernmost extent of the Black metropolis in its heyday in the 1940s and the early 1950s. Also missing from this rectilinear landscape are the diagonal naturalistic paths that were charted through this region long before any European settlement by the peoples of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi sovereign nations. On the other hand, there are presences that I see here that perhaps I don't see as clearly in this image. Among others, I see Carl Sandburg's City of the Big Shoulders, hog butcher, toolmaker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads, and freight handler. And if we were to dive in a little closer to one of these street corners, we might also see Gwendolyn Brooks' Real Cool Youth hanging out. Changing our perspective, facing the city, focusing on it, listening to it, opens a new kind of conversation, dialogic, situated, transgressive of typical lines of inquiry.
To that other. thing. Okay, because I'm also noticing too, like between these two images, they're both facing north, as if that's the city is north,
Yeah,
right? You don't even see the south side.
The
It's like
horizon.
yeah.
in fact, I don't have any, hang on, let me go back. I don't have any clear way to prove it, but I did notice back in one of these images that in some of it almost seems as though they have used AI to bring the city closer, to bring the skyline into closer proximity, thereby erasing all of this, which I think is just fascinating. Whoops, I totally went the wrong way. This is the danger of using the clicker and not practicing with it very often. The newness of this conversation invites, I would suggest, a new kind of responsibility as well. And that's the aspect of facing the city that I'd like us to turn to. In order to do that, I want to introduce a new interlocutor. We owe much of the phenomenology of encounter, of facing the other, to the Lithuanian Jewish philosopher Emanuel Levinas, who was born in 1906 and died in 1995. I take it from Levinas, who is always present in my own thought, that our dialogue with the city is always inherently imbalanced, but not in the way that we might imagine. In the wake of the Holocaust, in which almost all of his family was killed, Levinas sought to provide a post-ontological foundation for ethics. That is, one which relies not on a shared understanding of the world as it is, but rather on our infinitely variable experiences within that world. His stepping off point is the experience of the face of the other, which simultaneously astonishes and convicts me as its observer. When I face another, I bring to that encounter all of my assumptions, my presuppositions, my biases. But the face of the other in its animation speaks for itself, challenging and disrupting my egoic claim to understand it. In so doing, it opens before me a view of the infinite, of that which I do not and will not ever fully understand. I had thought that I was the actor, the knower, facing the other, but now the tables have turned, and faced by the infinite, I only have two options, says Levinas. I can lay down my prior claims, humbling myself before the other's self-knowledge, or I can insist on my prerogative to know their truth better than they know it themselves, which Levinas says is tantamount to murder. In this, then, is ethics. Faced with the other in their nakedness, their destitution, their vulnerability, but also their absolutely unique and overflowing abundance, I find myself implicated, called upon to respond, and not just by their face. In his writings, Levinas suggests that the contortion of the suffering body, the strain on the laboring back, the despair in the set of the shoulders can also face me, nor is it confined to the present moment of encounter, although it is in the present that I come to understand my obligation. But once I've seen it, according to Levinas, it will haunt me. It will implicate me, even from a past that was not of my making. Even an aesthetic experience can face me, Levinas suggests, and leave me breathless before my own obligation. And if this is true, why not a place, a street corner memorial, an apartment, a back alley, a block, a neighborhood, each one bursting with stories that overwhelm my pretense of understanding them, our pretenses of understanding, and issue a firm command: thou shalt not murder. Of course, murder can happen on many scales. Dwight Conquergood was an anthropologist and professor at Northwestern University, known for his ethnographies of some of Chicago's most vulnerable refugee communities, especially in Albany Park, where he lived. In his later years, he became attuned to the moral implications of the production and performance of this kind of situated knowledge, developing frameworks like the one that you see here, by which he meant to tease out the subtleties of what Levinas might describe as intellectual forms of murder. On this diagram, north is the pole of identity, which refers to kind of a facile capitalistic over-identification with the other. Think of this as sort of a neoliberal colorblind as well. We're all basically the same, so our experiences are all the same. To the south is the pole of difference, which exists in the claim that the other is wholly alien to me and therefore beyond empathy. You can sort of imagine this as incarnated with MAGA cruelty these days. To the east, we see commitment, which refers to the high value that I place on my knowing of the other. However, cynically or selfishly, I find a value in the relationship, albeit one that is exploitive or egoic. To the west, detachment refers to my disinterest in engagement, the lack of value that I assign to a potential relationship with the other. Conquergood assigns pithy descriptions to each of these quadrants and to the kinds of intellection that happen within them. These are drawn, in some cases, quite directly from a critique of his own colleagues and even of his own work. But again, I think that these can function at a range of scales. Think, if you will, of how Chicagoans collectively experienced and responded to experiences of alterity as it became an increasingly diverse city in the early 20th century. In this period, we can see the reductive but profitable ways that the cultures of the world were depicted right outside our front door on the Midway. The waves of slumming that passed through Chicago, in which middle-class white people traveled to urban neighborhoods to mingle with first immigrants, then Negroes, then pansies and dykes, often experimenting along the way with alternative lifestyles, different sexualities, different identities. Imagine, if you will, the isolation of marginalized populations to designated vice districts for study and control, and the strangely disembodied rhetoric with which the city's Race Relations Commission, half of whose members were Black, analyzed and responded to the horrifying surge of racial violence that rocked and bloodied the city in the Red Summer of 1919. We could think on a more local scale as well, perhaps about our own institution and the ways that it has confronted the neighborhoods around us. For example, how the new and more compatible Hyde Park that our experts planned and built in the 1950s conspicuously excluded the neighborhood's working class residents and most of its non-white population. I say excluded, but that doesn't mean forgot about. In fact, to the question that came up earlier, plans were made for these less desirable populations and places were set aside for them. Places in Englewood, like Parkway Gardens, which we saw in the earlier photo, and in Washington Park, like the Robert Taylor homes. These new communities were designed according to the most current theories of good urban design available to the university and its allies, and were calculated to ensure the most efficient possible model of human flourishing, no matter what the new residents might think about that. Closer to our own time, we might think about the university's housing assistance program, which offers scaled grants to staff who purchase homes in the neighborhoods immediately around our campus. Recently, the program was changed to provide higher amounts for purchases in Washington Park and West Woodlawn, the areas in green on this image, after Hyde Park and East Woodlawn were declared to be established. The smallest grants are available to those staff persons who choose to buy in the greater South Side area, represented in blue, and no grants at all are available to contract employees. For example, those who work here in food service or as custodians or who drive our shuttles. Or to use an example that I just found yesterday, here we see our Office of Civic Engagement visually claiming credit for a Chicago Park District program in a Park District facility located on a piece of Park District land that we have branded as ours, but that has never been a part of our campus. All of these, I would argue, can be fruitfully understood as forms of violence perpetrated at the scale of our institution, confronted by and responding to the otherness of the communities that surround it, just as the previous set of examples confronted it on the scales of the city and of the individual scholar. Murder is surprisingly easy, and it won't surprise you to hear that it is also easily done by instructors in their classes and by students as they confront the city. And for this reason, Chicago Studies' perpetual internal informal motto and preeminent ethical commitment since I first confronted the idea of Chicago Studies in 2013 has always been first, do no harm. I am profoundly aware that our students and instructors are confronting a city, are entering into communities that already feel wounded by our institution's actions. They are implicated in narratives of which they know nothing, but whose legacy they can far too easily perpetuate and extend. A lot of our students, a lot of our structures have been designed to respond to this and to prevent this perpetuation of harm upon our vulnerable neighbors. How do we meet that responsibility? Here, as in all things, our greatest impact is through courses in which we hope to encourage more direct engagement with the city while also communicating a stance of deep respect for it. I've already mentioned our microgrants program, which communicates respect not only to those community members who are paid to participate in our classes, but also in reverse to the instructors of those classes by establishing the norm that our partners' knowledge and time are valuable. Each grant and each Chicago Studies cross-listing comes with an offer of one-on-one advising to the instructor. Yes, to better understand their content and plan for their pedagogical choices, but also to gain a seat at the table in shaping the course, especially where and how it intends to engage the city. We also assert a list of pedagogical preferences for all classes that we support, privileging first-person narratives and direct experience to learn about the city, foregrounding questions of epistemic injustice, and recommending the inclusion of, quote, higher impact teaching and learning practices, all of which privilege reflection and encounter across axes of difference. In practice, this means that an instructor who comes interested in learning about the decline of the Midwest steel industry will be encouraged to do so by focusing on specific communities in Southeast Chicago. And instead of just talking about them, will be supported to go there with their students and to be guided through those communities by informants like documentarian Stephen Walsh, who's back, we see, Levinasi in the back can still face you, I guess. Be guided through communities by informants with personal connections to those places' histories. Will help that instructor to articulate the learning goals for this experience beforehand and a reflective praxis for helping the students to document their learning afterwards. Thinking about those priorities is built into the grant application, in fact. And we'll also make sure that the docent gets paid. It's not actually a really hard sell, but it is harder than just giving a lecture, which is why we work so hard to make it easier for instructors. As Chicago Studies profile has grown, and with it our direct support for individual students and their academic projects, especially BA thesis and capstone projects, we've also articulated a set of principles for that audience. These will seem familiar to anyone who has taught with us: a preference for embedded and local knowledges, attention to mutual benefit and collaboration. But again, they're actually based on a first do no harm commitment, derived in this case from the kinds of errors that I've most commonly seen in earnest but inexperienced researchers who don't always think too far beyond their own needs. Again, we leverage a combination of microgrants and advising here, plus the promise of a transcripted undergraduate certificate, which is really just a lightly incentivized structured advising program to earn a hearing with students in which we try to prevent the worst possible outcomes. It may not seem it, given the stories that we tell on our spooky Chicago walking tour, but we actually take thou shalt not murder very seriously in Chicago Studies. And we have to, because our wounded city constantly reminds us that we must. As an institution, we have a long way to go before we arrive even at the first step. doing no harm, not murdering, and miles further before we really begin to meaningfully confront and repair the legacies of the damage done by those before us and those around us. But in this, there is a paradoxical hope. If I, according to Levinas, accept the obligation with which I am faced, if I lay aside my egoic claims to authority and ownership of the other, I am also putting myself in the disposition to be taught. And what I stand to learn is what I truly have to offer in a way that would otherwise be unknowable to me. I think of this as the distinction between the golden rule and the platinum rule. In the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, I'm actually imposing my idea of the good onto you. But in the platinum rule, do unto others as they would have you do unto them, I'm offering you what you really want for yourself. The only problem is I don't know what you want until I shut up, sit down, and enter into non-coercive dialogue with you. To return to our buddy Dwight Conquergood for a moment, this stance allows us to occupy a space of meaningful engagement and ethical performance within and among the murderous extremes. It's into this space that we'll head for the final part of my remarks. What emerges when we face the city, understanding that it is always facing us first, that we are informed and even illuminated by it and not the other way around? Let me begin once again with a picture from just a few weeks ago. In it, we see a group of UChicago students sharing a meal at Flossmoor Station Restaurant with UChicago alum, longtime pastor, and Governor State University founder, Dr. Larry McClellan. Also present is Nancy Spiegel, a history librarian at the Reg and a resident of the South Suburbs, where Flossmoor is located, as well as Mansueto and Chicago Studies Research Fellow April Graham-Jackson and her husband Rod, and members of their family, also from the South Suburbs. When this picture was taken, the group was halfway through a guided tour of the South Suburbs, Chicago's Black Southland, led by Larry, organized by April to help introduce her students, her research team, to the communities that they would be helping her to study. April's research, in turn, builds on Larry's lifelong work tracing the legacy of the Underground Railroad across the Midwest, a trace that left some of Chicago's earliest suburbs, Black suburbs, in its wake, a narrative that calls into question a lot of what we think we know about suburbanization, including when it happened, why it happened, and for who. Sometime during this day, perhaps at this very table, Nancy would realize that Larry's extensive personal archives, raw material for April's research, should really be cataloged and preserved at the Reg. April would learn that there are oral histories from Black elders across the region that need to be collected, as well as others that need to be digitized. The students would learn that their quarter-long research assistantships are meaningful and emotionally resonant for real people, like April's family, who learned that the stories of their home are important enough for the world-renowned University of Chicago to document. And in talking with and listening to April tell me all about all of this later that same day, I would learn that Chicago Studies needs to create some summer research assistant positions to help April and Larry and Nancy carry their collective work forward. In 2022, at the beginning of his final year as dean of the college, my friend and fellow bicycle enthusiast, John Boyer, devoted a considerable portion of his annual welcome message to the value of the city in the undergraduate experience. While I was pleased that he did so, I was less than thrilled with his framing, which, to be fair, was entirely in line with a very long tradition of university-centered discourse about the city, a history which John, of course, knows better than anyone. That history began with our founding president, William Rainey Harper, who imagined the young institution having a sort of noblesse oblige that drives us beyond our cloistered quadrangles, our walled city, out into the streets of the dirty, noisy industrial city of Carl Sandburg's poems. For its time, it was a remarkable attitude, and Harper is actually often cited as the inspiration of the university civic engagement movement that would flower a century later. Contrast it, however, with our buddy Emmanuel, where Harper imagines the university drawing from its vast store of intellectual and human capital to teach those outside it a source of light that emanates from us to the provinces, Levinas sees true knowing, a knowing far more profound than that which we already contain, as being possible only when we are in relationship, which bathes us in the light of the infinite. Both thinkers see us oriented towards a beyond, towards the horizon. But where Harper seemingly suggests that we march out into the frontier, Levinas sees us drawn into mystery. One imagines us as soldiers, the other as pilgrims. Lest I leave you with the impression that John Boyer doesn't understand this distinction, let me change his image and share with you another quote from another later time in that same year. The city as partner in a conversation that builds the life, not only of the mind, but also of the embodied person, interpersonal, civic, and cultured. This remains a key piece of John's understanding of how the college forms our students. What does it mean to be pilgrims here in the Windy City? What are the disciplines that pilgrimage imposes upon us, and how might we live them out? Before all else, I'd like to offer a few thoughts for what it might mean for us in this room as thinking persons doing situated intellectual work. And then I'll offer a few examples from Chicago Studies' current praxis. And finally, I'll think with you into the beyond. I've invoked this idea of situated knowledges a few times today, and I think it's time to give the concept its authors due. Donna Haraway is a professor at UC Santa Cruz who interrogates themes of epistemology, especially in the sciences and technology, from a feminist perspective. Her definition for me offers a vision of the kinds of knowing that I'd really like to see emerge from a Levinasian approach to the city. And it also brings us back to Conquergood's work on engaged academic praxis. As I mentioned at the end of the last section, the goal of Conquergood's analysis of academic praxis, especially within his own field of anthropology, was not to make all anthropologists feel like shit, but rather to give hazy definition to the space within which an authentic and even liberating praxis might take place. He describes this as a dialogical performance, which I take as a reference to Paulo Freire's concept of knowledge as constructed in dialogue, and which produces something very similar, I would say, to Haraway's situated knowledges. Notably, it's not univocal. Rather, it's possible in the midst of that, in this space, to discern differing forms of praxis depending on one's commitments as an engaged scholar. Here we're working with the same axes as before, but now we're in an ethical space. So to the north, scholarship that identifies with and is oriented towards the others, whoever they may be. To the south, scholarship that is less external looking, more confined to academic or disciplinary concerns. To the east, applied scholarship, which emphasizes relevance. To the west, pure scholarship, which emphasizes rigor. What I like about this framework in part is that it reminds me that meaningful academic engagement, authentically dialogic, situated praxis can occur in and bear fruit for a wide range of disciplinary and functional specializations, even for those whose basic commitments are different than my own. Likewise, I appreciate that this heuristic can be applied to activities at various scales, from individual academic projects to courses at the university, and even as we contemplate our individual responsibilities as academics and thinking persons to our nation in these very difficult times. With our personal obligations in mind, I'd like to share a few commitments or perhaps dispositions that have come to characterize Chicago Studies' collective praxis, as well as a few that are still very much aspirational for us. The first of these is curiosity. Nowhere is our pilgrim disposition more clearly on display than in our urban hikes, the spiritual descendants of John Boyer's bike tours, in which faculty and staff and community members map a bit of their personal fascination onto a little bit of the city and take students along for the ride. Many of these happen during orientation and welcome weeks, and so serve to introduce new students not only to the hike's themes, but also to the technologies and attitudes that can help them to explore the city themselves. The goal, in short, is not to tell them everything about the city, but to model what respectful curiosity can look like, and then show them how free they are to follow their own curiosity throughout the city during their years in the college. A closely related commitment, especially in the curricular space, is to experimentation. Foregrounding the city can do more than decentering the role of the instructor. It can also call into question or relativize the guiding logics that govern, for example, our understanding of what a learning environment is, or the time period within which we attempt to achieve curricular outcomes. Encounter with the City has a way of broadening instructors' learning goals over time, leading to pedagogical experimentation like this very innovative and popular spring course, whose instructor arrived at a very John Boyer appropriate solution to the enduring challenge of maximizing students' direct exposure to the local environments and microcultures of the South Side. He conducted the entire course on bicycles. My role with instructors like this is to help them clarify their goals, brainstorm solutions, assess risks, propose evaluative measures, and then remove the obstacles that they encounter along the way. It doesn't always work, but we learn every time we try. Another core commitment is the engagement of community voice in all stages of knowledge creation. I think we're all familiar with the various stages of research in advising students whose projects are situated between the city and the college. We encourage them to think about who's at the table at each stage of the process. Of course, there's a lot of room for variety here. On any given project, a question might come from the community, which may also have strong ideas about how best to explore that question. Data may be gathered primarily by the student, but she may need community help to interpret and analyze it. And then the promulgation of results might be a close collaboration to ensure that those results are shared with all of the relevant publics in a way that fully respects the extent of the partnership itself. Every project's a little different. The key is that we plan it in a way that takes full advantage of the assets of everyone involved, and that fully respects and celebrates their contributions. Of course, this doesn't just happen with students. To return to our earlier example, we can literally see who's at the table as April's Black Southland cohort does their work. April may have formulated the research question, but its spirit comes from her and her family's lived experience as a suburban Black family. The cohort's plan for exploration was shaped by April in dialogue with Nancy and also with myself. Larry and his regional contacts are playing a substantial role in providing the data, but the student's superior knowledge of digital resources is already expanding what we thought we could know from more traditional sources. And April's husband, Rod, has been following along and extending the process further by providing photographic documentation of moments like this one all along the way. April will analyze and interpret the data in close collaboration with Larry and her other academic advisors, and the ways they share the results of their efforts and plan their next steps will likely involve almost everybody at that table, as well as others who have entered the process at its later stages. Mention of April's project highlights yet another commitment of Chicago Studies to critique. You've seen it in real time today. To face the city, especially its minoritized communities, from the University of Chicago is to be taught about past and sometimes present wrongs whose legacies people must live in. For example, the ecological model of urban development proposed by Ernest Burgess for the city in 1925 effectively imposed an evolutionary narrative on city regions that assigned the highest value to suburbanized middle to upper class white families, while assigning other populations to the urban core. This shaped the spatial imaginary, thank you for that phrase, April, and with it planning and government policy and individual aspiration for decades, with significant consequences for those populations whose ambitions were circumscribed or ignored within it. The implications of this theoretical murder of Black aspirations wouldn't be understood and therefore could not be remedied if it were not for April's research, which arises from her family's lived experience. On a more local scale, Chicago Studies has spent almost 3 years doing a detailed study of the effects of those 1950s era urban university planned urban renewals on the neighborhoods around our campus. Students have painstakingly documented changes to the built environment on individual blocks of major thoroughfares over the past century, enabling them to retell the neighborhood's stories in terms of how their residents were affected, instead of from the perspective of the major institutional players, in this case, the university, the administration of Richard J. Daley, and the federal government. The scale of change and the corresponding volume of loss for longtime residents emerges clearly in just these two maps of 55th Street, the top one from 1920 and the lower one more or less from the present day. In the former, the corridor is characterized by dense multi-use housing and construction that also supports a thriving small business network. In the latter, over half of the street is either vacant or consigned to institutional use, representative of a nearly 70% decline in population and the loss of over 300 commercial outlets to the residents of the neighborhood. This kind of analysis, combined with archival materials like this image of residents moving a beloved local hardware store's inventory to a new location across the neighborhood, paints a much more detailed picture of the impacts of university policymaking on the neighborhood that it faced with technocratic detachment. We can't effect healing until we know what we've done and acknowledge it with the communities we hurt and talk about the implications of those hurts even unto the present day. We have murdered, and it seems that one thing Chicago Studies can do for the city and for our institution is to serve as a voice of conscience. That said, we are also a voice of celebration. The original grant that established Chicago Studies made provision for an edited volume anthologizing the best undergraduate research about the city to be published annually. We continue to publish it until today. Having one's work published in the Chicago Studies Annual is a tremendous honor, but until fairly recently, its volumes mostly gathered dust on the shelves in the reg and in offices like mine. In the past few years, we've built a partnership with the Library Center for Digital Scholarship that makes the volumes of Chicago Studies, but also all BA research conducted and focused on the city of Chicago, permanently available to the general public outside any firewall on Knowledge at U Chicago, the university's public access digital repository. We've incentivized student submission of that work to Knowledge by merging that process with consideration for our annual research prize. If you submit for the one, you're opting into the other. Those accumulated papers actually get a lot of use, in part because I know the collection so well, evaluating them for the prize, and so I'm able to recommend them to future students, to course instructors, and to external partners. That brings me to a few aspirational goals. This photo was taken during an architectural studio course called Children in Architecture, great class design. Students were hanging out with kids, learning about how kids see architecture and experience it. This particular version partnered up with a school in Englewood and actually won a $1.5 million prize from the city of Chicago to build the collaborative designs that they had come up with. The course's instructor is one of several who would love to talk more and think more about what an engaged pedagogy looks like. And yet it's really hard to pull 100 different cats into one room. It just doesn't ever seem to happen. I'm hoping that ongoing collaborations with the Center for Teaching and Learning can help us to think about how we can advance more discourse around the scholarship of teaching and learning in the engagement space. This is a rendering of what's called the Woodlawn Central Initiative, about which my friend David Wiltz will be speaking here on May 9th. David called and asked me for some help because he was running into a problem. They're proposing to build a lot of higher density multi-use structures in the east section of Woodlawn, and the city had pushed back saying there's never been that kind of density in Woodlawn. Wrong. We have the historical evidence to prove that actually there was at least that much density in the past. And here's a place where Chicago Studies research suddenly discovered a use for itself that we had not known that it possessed. And so we're thinking about how we might begin to frame Chicago Studies as more of a public square, a place to which other people can bring questions and where we can maybe work on answering them all together. As with teaching about Chicago, the collaborative asking and answering of questions sometimes breaks down, not in the content, but in the process. A few years ago, I had a group of students working with a nonprofit, and we were trying to plan a final event, and the nonprofit just seemed really resistant to it. And it finally came out that the reason they didn't want to do a final event was that they didn't have a room that was big enough, that had AV capability and Wi-Fi. We have rooms at the University of Chicago, and they all have Wi-Fi, even if it doesn't always work. And so we're hoping to use some of those rooms for a 20th anniversary conference in which we experiment with convening a larger and more public conversation about our curiosity to to this wonderful place and all that it has to teach us. For a pilgrim, reaching one's destination is at best a secondary goal. What matters is how you're transformed by the journey. Thank you for taking a little journey with me, slightly longer than I had expected, and for spending time thinking about what our city has taught and may yet teach us. I would love your comments, your insights, and if you have them, your questions here and in the time after. Thanks. Too humanistic, a lot of philosophy, sorry. It's my background. Any questions I can take? I know we're close to time. Yeah.
Beautiful talk, Chris.
Thank you.
I love this kind of alternative pantheon you've built for us that includes T.S. Eliot and Andrew Bird and Sufjan Stevens and
Oh, it's a best.
but the Carl Sandburg.
Yeah.
So Carl Sandburg is kind of lyricizing, if that's the right word, someone who sort of is part of the existing pantheon, at least here in Sigu, namely William Cronon,
Yes.
Nature's Metropolis.
Love him.
And the the argument being that Chicago basically exists because of the vast agricultural and natural resources of the whole
Yeah.
the continent essentially. So my question for you is like, what's Chicago? I mean, April's project's already pushing us beyond the municipal boundaries, but like what is, as far as Chicago studies is concerned, what is Chicago?
It's a really great question. I mean, Chicago has been different things. It's occupied different scales and different geographies over its long history, right? Hyde Park, where we are today, was not Chicago until just before the World's Fair. When we realized that we'd better gobble it up really quickly, otherwise we weren't going to get the tax revenue from everything that happened at the Columbian Exposition. I'm inclined these days, and my understanding has been stretched by other people's projects. I am inclined these days to allow our interlocutors in the region to tell us what Chicago is. Just earlier today, I had a student ask if Rockford could be considered in conjunction with the Chicago Studies BA Prize. And we've certainly taken submissions about the Indiana Dunes. So I'm perfectly willing to think about Rockford, especially if the project is really thinking at the scale of the region and the way in which, and this is a project about transit, so of course it is. Yeah, I think that I love leaving a little bit of flexibility there. I'm sort of inspired in this by Emily Talon's really cool work about how Chicagoans think of their neighborhoods, as opposed to the structures that were given to them by social scientists at this institution in the 20s and 30s, who never claimed that those were neighborhoods, but now they're all over the billboards at O'Hare telling us that we have 77 of them, which means that O'Hare itself is a neighborhood, which is just a disgusting notion. Yeah, Chris.
Chris, don't mean to put you on the spot, but I
Yeah.
want to ask, our current president has made engagement with the city a higher priority, or at least in terms of his speech, he has suggested that, I forget his exact term, you may know it, we're going to become a university of the city or something along these lines. It's been a major platform of his presidency, and he seems genuinely interested in increasing the ways in which
He came on the bike tour.
university
He's a
engages
very slow biker.
with both communities and the city. So I guess my sense is, what do you make of that, and what substance has it yielded? What have you noticed a change in the way the university engages with the city, and in what way?
This was an easier question until you asked about the substance. There has been a movement, I would say, that was inaugurated by President Bob Zimmer, who came in 2006 and gave a major speech to the City Club of Chicago about a turn back towards the city on the part of the university that invoked some of the history I brought up of William Rainey Harper and others. Zimmer and his vision, I would say, have definitely been picked up rhetorically by our current administration. By their fruits you shall know them. And I'm interested to see what kinds of concrete commitments come out of a rhetorical claim to being there for the city. As you mentioned earlier, my background is partially in theology, and in theology, prepositions really matter. And so I think it's going to be an interesting question whether we understand ourselves as a university of the city, a university with the city, a university for the city, or a university in the city. All of those things could mean really different things, especially as they are enacted. One action that I have noticed that disturbs me is that there has been a significant cutback in those pieces of our civic engagement apparatus that empower students to directly engage the city, especially in these kind of longer term partnerships. Shops like University Community Service Center or the Neighborhood Schools Program, which has had students doing long residencies in neighborhood schools for years and years. I find that to be concerning. But that could be something transitional. We're in a period of budget crunch. Everyone was asked to cut. But I noticed that there were no corresponding cuts to, for example, our Office of Commercial Real Estate Operations. So things to think about. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if there are other universities, college institutions in Chicago that are also doing this work in Chicago studies. Maybe their work is more like neighborhood specific, or maybe in Chicago studies here, we're focusing more on places like Vermont Park, but I was just wondering if you could speak to the experience of some of the other universities.
I cut my teeth in what was called the Center for Experiential Learning, now the Center for Experiential Learning, Teaching, and Scholarship at Loyola University up on the far north side. They have a very deep commitment to the northern neighborhoods of the city, and their work extends up into Evanston. The landscape in Evanston is a little bit more fragmented. At Northwestern, like us, they're a very decentralized institution. You have lots of little pockets, groups that are doing different kinds of work at different scales around the city. North Park University has an enormous commitment, as does Loyola, both of them faith-based institutions with DePaul. They have a very big commitment to what we might call service learning, which is I would say slightly more paternalistic, but often very fruitful way of collaborating with communities in the curricular space. That's happening across a wide range of classes, certainly at Loyola and DePaul. North Park is a smaller institution, but they've got a really neat program that follows what's called the Bonner model, which I'm happy to talk to you about later. It has to do with undergraduate research. It's kind of mentored over a period of years and resembles our certificate. DePaul, in addition to the work that I've already described, has the Egan Center for Urban Studies, which is led by the same anthropologist, actually, who runs their kind of service learning programs. That does kind of engaged urban research. They have a really big footprint on the west side, bigger than I think a lot of people understand. And of course, to the west of us is UIC. UIC has a number of profoundly interesting research operations. These tend to be a little bit more professionalized than some of what you're seeing at other universities. I would say, honestly, that our commitment to the city, while it is unique, is by no means the most substantial among Chicago institutions. We do try to think about the city a lot, but sometimes we are the few, the proud, we band of brothers and sisters and so on. But yeah, so we're a little idiosyncratic in the way that we approach it. A lot of these other offices either do it from very much kind of a policy quantitative research space, or they do it from this sort of more pedagogical approach. We kind of blend those in a way that's a little bit unusual and that expresses, usually when it's not me talking, expresses sort of less ideological commitment. And then there's Governor's State and Chicago State universities to the south of us. I happen to notice that I think Chicago State is actually hiring for a new director for a program of community engagement, which to me says that they continue to be very committed to that work. I'm not as familiar with the work that Governor's State does, but I'm sure that there's a foundation there given the way that it was founded. We are totally out of time, but I am happy to take people's additional questions. Also, and I forgot to say this at the beginning, Chicago Studies, whatever else you may think of it, we're really known for our swag. So we have our stickers and our poster that explains the history of Chicago in sticker designs over there on the side. Please do help yourself. Thank you so much.